Hi, and welcome to the first part of Lecture 6, or the first part of the lectures for Week 6. And this week we're going to go into some depth about one particular topic that then will feed in the others. We've already talked about class, and class is hard to see and understand because it's a structure that's not made very visible. And so we tried to talk about the ways in which class patterns underlie what occurs. Gender and sexuality are kind of the opposite, in the sense that they're so visible that we take them for granted, and so everybody is aware of their gender and sexuality. We're aware of the gender and sexuality of others, and they seem to us to be natural. And science reinforces that a lot with the idea that we can explain human behaviour scientifically means to explain it in terms of individual biology. You see that in psych and the mainstream press in all sorts of ways. And we talked already in the first part of the course about the sex-gender distinction, but we'll cover that again. And this lecture is about a critique of biological essentialism, which is just absolutely fundamental to understanding the sociological critique of sex and gender. And more broadly, if you're going to be writing about transgender or thinking about those issues, then that we need to get past that essentialism. So in this lecture we look at a whole range of things about science, the goods and bads of science, and the feminist critiques that have helped try to think through these things. So earlier in the term we talked about the individual and society and how those two things were connected, and I tried to sort of tease out the fact that this binary was not really two separate things at all, and more was going on than a collection of individuals, but society had its own dynamics, and that's what we looked at in sociology. And we had a discussion about free will and determinism and how much society controlled us and so on. The second big debate in the literature is really around the role of biology or nature and nurture, and there's a long history of tension between sociology and biology, and that's because we've seen the way it's been used. So in this lecture I want to recap that history and look at the way science has been used to justify inequality. So we really take issue with the reductionism that's inherent in a lot of science. We say it's bad science, and many scientists agree with this sort of idea that reductionism isn't the whole story and can distort what's happening. And the other side of the science story too tends to be this incredible hubris that exists, where whatever scientists say is the case is taken to be so. So if we look now at this lecture by Christoph Koch, he's a leading neurobiology professor in the United States at UCLA, and here he's just introducing a talk that he's going to give on perception, so those of you studying psychology might be interested to have a look at the whole lecture. But just in the introduction he stops to make a point about we need to be more careful about how we understand what it is that we know. And we tend to exaggerate when we start to talk about the brain does this or genes do that. That exaggerates the level of the extent of our real understanding.
Today I feel completely grounded compared to talk about immortality. So I'm not going to talk about immortality or downloading our minds and being able to model the entire human brain. One dirty secret that's little appreciated: the best understood organisms, bar none, is a little worm called C. elegans, the roundworm. The roundworm has 968 cells, of which 1/3, 302, are nerve cells. So it's a creature that it's been around for several hundred million years, has 302 cells, the neurons. We have its complete wiring diagram, and we have no understanding whatsoever at the system level how this creature works. There's no general purpose program. There are individual models to model a small subset of it, the larynx, the anus, and other parts, sort of 10 or 20 neurons. There's no general program that has any understanding of the worm as a whole system, and that's only 302 neurons. So just as a cautionary tale.
Right, so as he says, a cautionary tale before he begins to talk about the brain, which has 4.5 billion neurons. Let's be aware that our understanding of even the simplest organisms is still quite limited, so we need to just be aware of that when we start talking about the brain does this or whatever. So that's an important warning, I think, that we tend to exaggerate what we really do understand, because what we understand is so enormous, of course, but we have to be careful not to run it out. The other reason, apart from it being bad science, that sociologists adopt a skeptical or critical attitude to science is that it's bad politics. That scientists have, science over the years has been used to justify all sorts of inequality, and so like the notion of common sense that we talked about, when people say it's common sense, it's really to cut off a discussion about what is going on. It prevents critical investigation. Well, the other one that does that is nature and the natural. If something is natural or part of nature, then we can't do anything to change that, and that's a very convenient place for power relations to hide. So we take the sociological imagination to science and have a look at it. So we know that science emerged during the Enlightenment, and its argument was the Enlightenment movement argument was that we should human reason should determine what we believe and what we do, not religious dogma. That humans are the measure of all things, or man, of course, as they said, are the measure of all things, not divine authority. And in a lot of ways, science was positioned as a competitor to religion. It was never really quite so much that way at the time, but there were certainly tensions between them, and there was a tendency for science to try to adopt a sort of God's eye point of view, which was a serious mistake when you're trying to understand what science is and how it works. Science can't compete with religion because there isn't a point outside the system that you can stand back and analyse it from. So, but often it's presented as this sort of infallible system, which it isn't. It's a bullshit detector, and a very powerful one, but it can't have a God's eye point of view on it because human beings are involved, and well, I would say there are no gods, so that God can't be used to create certainty. And you have to remember that whatever tensions existed between science and religion, that Charles Darwin was buried in Westminster Abbey, so the distance between them can't have been quite as great as perhaps it seems in retrospect. But the model of science that came out of the Enlightenment was a mechanical one. It was based on Newton's physics, so the universe was like a giant clock. For Descartes, one of the leading philosophers of the Enlightenment, animals were just machines, as you can see in the little diagram of the duck there, and humans were partly machines and partly a non-material substance, or a spirit or a ghost. So that gave rise to the expression that for Descartes human beings were ghosts in a machine, with all the attendant debates then about how those two things were connected. So it's a dualistic view between the body and the mind, nature and spirit. That structure of thinking about things is a reductionist one. It says the key question for science should be, what is it made of? And we answer that question by breaking it down into the simplest parts. It's a very powerful tool. But the problem is that when you start looking at complex systems, you lose a great deal of understanding of those systems if you argue that they are nothing but the sum of the parts. So that understanding means understanding the bits that make it up. And then we can identify a real cause. So that's where you get the idea then that humans are just animals. And humans are certainly animals, but I would say they're more than that. So we have to understand about the biology, but we need to go beyond that in understanding what humans are. Human beings are just gene carriers. That evolution, the enormous complexity of evolution in animal communities at the species level, at the community of animals level, at the ecosystem level. People say, people like Richard Dawkins say, well, we're really just about selfish genes reproducing themselves. And of course he's being a bit polemical there, but that's a reductionist view that really, when all that complexity is taken away, what you've really got is some tiny little piece that makes it real. And the same sort of idea that science is really physics, that all biology is chemistry, that everything can be reduced, and the most complex can be reduced down to the simplest. So since biology depends on chemical reactions in the cells, the argument is that it's really chemistry. And of course for the physicists they can say, well, all of those molecular interactions are dependent on the physics of atoms that underlie them, which they are. But that doesn't mean that chemistry is really physics, because there is a separate level that things operate on. So you can't, you can know that salt is made up of sodium and chloride. So sodium is an explosive metal and chloride's a poisonous gas, but that doesn't tell you anything about the salt that is produced by the combination of the events. There's a set of emergent properties that are quite different from the parts. So we argue, even in science, a reductionist view is misleading. And indeed this has been challenged by people within science. So there's a whole range of systems thinking, a whole range of complexity, a whole range of chaos, and these are the kinds of ways of thinking that we either have used in sociology or are interested in looking at as more complex ways to deal with the kinds of complex systems that sociology deals with. And Fritjof Capra is he's a physicist, but he has a long-standing interest in ecosystems, and there's quite a nice short interview with him. It goes about 10 minutes, it's on the website, but I'll just play a grab from it now.
I need to talk a little bit about the nature of the synthesis that I developed. Okay. What I discovered going through the history of systems thinking was that you can say that there are two approaches to understanding nature which have been in competition with one another throughout the history of Western philosophy and science. And one approach starts with the question, what is it made of? And that was the dominant approach. You take things to pieces, you study basic building blocks, components, elements, and so on. So in this approach you study matter, you study quantities, structures, and so on. The other approach does not start with the question, what is it made of, but asks, what is the pattern? And when you study the pattern, you study relationships, you study qualities, you study organization. And my synthesis really consists in putting those two together, because when you want to understand life, you need both. You need to understand, the DNA, the macromolecules, and all the molecular biology, but you also need to understand the patterns of life and how things are related. And it turns out, when you go into some detail of how to synthesize those two, that you need a third one. And the third one is the process dimension. You need to understand the process of life. And so, in this synthesis, I have three perspectives on life. You could call them three conceptual dimensions. And one is the structure dimension, one is the pattern dimension, and the third is the process dimension. When you look at those three, only one of the three is material, the structure dimension. You see, a pattern is not something material, it's a set of relationships. Process is not something material. So if I were to say, to what extent is my view materialistic, I would say 33.3%. It's a third of the synthesis.
I see.
So it's not a materialistic view. However, I do believe that mind and consciousness emerge from matter at a certain level of complexity. And the organization becomes such that the processes involved and the patterns involved are those we associate with life, with living systems.
That's Fritjof Capra sort of bringing together the basic point there I wanted to make about reductionism versus systems thinking. And also there in the course of that he talks about the difference between the quantitative and the qualitative that we talked about in relation to research, that the physical sciences and the biological sciences overwhelmingly are oriented historically towards the quantities, to the numbers, but more and more becoming aware that there are qualitative relationships that need to be taken into account. So that would be consistent with the sort of sociology we've been looking at this term. We could ask about the structure of science, and when we're walking through the sociological imagination, we could think of that in terms of class and race and gender, and we could say, what does it mean that most of the world's scientists are white men, and have been historically, or that most of the world's scientific research is funded by the military or by large pharmaceutical or fertiliser companies. And they'd be important questions, and we take those up in STS to some extent, next term, Social Science, Technology and Society, next term if you do that subject. And they're good questions, but I want to look at what science, and particularly its popular presentations, say about the sorts of inequalities that occur within the structures we've been looking at. So those of you no doubt would have heard something about IQ, and you'll certainly pick this up in psychology. Louis Binet, who invented the IQ test, initially had the idea that he wanted to measure the performance of children, third graders, and so he did a whole bunch of studies of the abilities of third graders, and then he created a test that he could say, okay, here is the average abilities of third graders, and then in relation to that standard that he'd set, he set about measuring them and could then say, okay, well, you're within this close to the mean or this far from the mean. So it was never intended to measure some inherent ability. It was simply a way of using a standardised test to measure where someone was on a continuum, so that you could then presumably provide remedial action. There was no claim in there that this measured their innate ability or anything. But when these forms of testing moved to the United States and were taken up by the government there, particularly by Terman at Stanford and Henry Goddard, they began pioneering mass IQ testing. So they tested the military, they tested immigrants, and then of course they found all sorts of social patterns that they could then attribute to IQ. So, you know, they said that 97% of all female prostitutes and 80% of truants and 50% of paupers were feeble-minded. There was a scientific terminology that said that they had an IQ of 175, and that was why they were paupers and prostitutes. That 70% of criminals had a low IQ, that you could tell from physical signs that, like excessive sexual activity made your eyes recede into your sockets, so you could tell scientifically by looking at the body what was wrong with someone. I mean, it's that sort of mythology about, stop it or you go blind, those kind of things that are passed into a sort of cultural common sense about the body, then or a joke. But this was science that was used then to explain class sorts of patterns on the basis of people's innate ability. And if you want to read more about that, I'd certainly recommend Stephen Jay Gould's book on The Mismeasure of Man, which is about IQ testing. He's someone who understands all the mathematics. He's a biologist who uses it to map evolutions, and he's able to do quite a good job of critiquing it. Here's another one. This is a diagram from the 1920s of people in different criminal classes, and the idea being that if you put all the people in criminal classes, you see, this is not a photograph of course, but the idea became too that you classify people according to different types, and the idea was that you could see a person's character by looking at all these different groups. You could say, well, that's what pickpockets look like, and that's what purse snatchers look like. That there's a type that they represent that is they manifested in their body. And that when photography came about, it became a common practice then, for this new technology of photography to begin melding pictures one over the other to build up a composite picture of what the type was like. And so, of course, crime then isn't explained by reference to class or to the nature of society, but is, by the founder of modern criminology, explained as a result of nature. It's just an innate characteristic of certain kinds of human beings that lends them to be naturally criminals. So people are born criminals, and you could identify this by physical defects that went back in time in evolution, and they really were sort of a throwback to some previous evolutionary thing like primitives and savages, which of course overlaps with our understanding of race. So all these kind of concepts were mixed in together. We talked briefly about deviance before, but policing of deviance and policing of society relies on the construction of these types. That there are certain types of people that require policing, and of course in the 19th century these identities then become a basis for creating identities. So what was originally a mechanism for governing population becomes internalised and lived out by people. So particularly homosexual identities and so on. Also a basis for resistance, of course. You can start to define it yourself. But defining the deviant is part of defining the normal and the norm, and this is what policing exists to do. By constructing different types, whether they're sexual types, the masturbator, the homosexual, the fertile couple and so on, as criminal or as a welcome addition that should be encouraged, is a way of governing the population. And so production of these types particularly in carceral institutions like prisons and clinics and hospitals, were the basis on which the state emerged to govern the social order. So if you look at those of you who do a little bit more psychology, I don't suppose you would have got to it quite yet, but you'll do a fair amount of statistics, and in that you can see the word statistics. The Pearson's correlation coefficient's one of the very early tools that you'll use for measuring statistical significance, and that was based on Karl Pearson's work. Now, Karl Pearson was an ardent proponent of eugenics. He openly advocated war against inferior races and saw that this is what these tools should be used for. And there's a quote from him there that the scientific view of the nation is that of an organised whole which has to be kept up to an internal efficiency by ensuring its numbers are recruited from better stock. So it's all about a breeding program, and you can see these things played out in Australia with a half-caste, quarter-caste, octoroon sort of categorisation of indigenous people as a scientific way of, supposedly scientific way of measuring differences and policing the nation. Of course, the same sorts of scientists, of course, have now debunked that notion altogether, but at the time this was mainstream sort of science. And really what happens then in terms of historical terms is that you get white people who colonised the world, of course, justified this not by saying that we enslaved the blacks, that's why they're slaves. It was much better to say that they were slaves because they were black. And so you have this mythology of race that inverted the story so that whites were civilised and blacks were savages, and that justified the whites' actions in colonising them. Most racists these days don't argue for biological racism anymore, because Adolf Hitler's activities made biological racism of this kind completely unacceptable when it was seen how far this idea would go in terms of eugenics and ethnic cleansing. But people are much more likely to express cultural racism these days, but we need to understand that whiteness is a myth as well. And remembering by a myth, I mean not something like a fairy tale or a fable. I mean a meaningful narrative, a set of stories we tell ourselves to make sense of the world, and race remains one of those. In colonial psychiatry, I studied some of this in my PhD. There were colonial psychiatrists again who explained the process of colonisation by saying, Octave Manoni was a French psychiatrist who explained that native people just had a psychological desire to be colonised. They were primitive, impulsive, childlike, and capable of abstract thought, or awfully irrationally and violent, and they internalised their inferiority. And so that was why they got colonised. They welcomed the colonisers, really, unless they were acting like children. But it was necessary for civilised people to carry out a civilising mission, to raise them up to our level, and that's what colonisation was apparently all about. And of course their violence was completely irrational. It wasn't a form of resistance to colonisation, it was just an irrational violence, like a child acting out something. Edward Said's another important writer, and he critiqued this view in his famous book on Orientalism. But we still see it around today that Arabs, it's quite common to talk about Arabs and terrorists in this kind of incredibly stereotyped sort of way, and if you read some of the foreign policy literature, it's all seen as a product of the Arab mind. They're just a different type of person, and therefore their behaviour is completely irrational. There's no need to try to understand why terrorists do what they do. They're just irrational. There's no reason for it. They just hate freedom, and they just hate us for no reason, and this is just a product of their mindset. So this kind of notion is still very common these days. And Said says that Western academic scholarship helped to create the stereotypes of non-Western cultures by putting them in these sort of classifications like Oriental or other that needed to be explained, because the West was the side of rationality and good sense, whereas these other people had strange customs that needed to be explained. So this kind of creation of these binaries exist in all of these axes of inequality. So in the next part I'll have a look at sex and gender. Okay, so in part one we looked at the issue of reductionism and the way that science had been used to reproduce racial discrimination. So in this section we're going to be looking at sex and gender, which we started talking about last week. So agents of and I mentioned the idea of binaries, and so agents of socialisation spent a lot of time trying to convince us that there are only two ways to be and everything else is normal and abnormal. So there's a binary of two sides. And I'll just quickly go over, last week we talked about how sociologists see sex as biological, male and female hermaphrodite, and gender as social, or the role you play, the masculine and feminine, and can be androgynous, and sexuality is something social. It's about the choice of object, heterosexual, homosexual and bisexual, and they're assumed to map onto each other pretty straightforwardly, that people with male bodies will be masculine, people with female bodies will be feminine, and both of them will be naturally heterosexual and attracted to each other. So just to be clear, sexism, like racism, is unfair discrimination based on sex. It can be in religion, law or language, and last week we talked about the sexual division of labour. Women work but they don't earn as much as men. They are concentrated in nursing, teaching and secretarial work. They do most of the unpaid work, and that's called patriarchy or institutionalised sexism. So just remember that when we're talking in sociological terms about these debates that we're talking about, that's what we're trying to explain. But sociology or biology, can these be used to explain these patterns? And our contention is, of course, that biology can't be. The most common explanation of sexual differences is that they're natural, that they're wired into the body, and that we express our sexuality in the way we do because our bodies, our hormones, our genes, our brains, our libido, whatever, determine that it will happen that way. And that's called biological determinism. Now, sociologists agree that biology has a role, but we say that it can't explain those social outcomes, and to do that you need to look at culture, which gives meaning to biology, not the other way around. In fact, if we were creatures of nature like birds and animals, then we would need a system of gender to tell us what to do, because the biology would drive it. So the fact that we have gender at all means that there's more going on than biology. So I want to look at the recent sociobiology or evolutionary psychology book by Thornhill and Palmer that talks about the evolutionary role of rape. So it seeks to explain why men rape and why women are victims, and why women who are more physically brutalised feel less mental trauma. I don't know where that comes from, but that's their contention. So in their book that was written in 2000, they argue that rape is a necessary part of evolution. It's natural because human reproductive potential means that men will seek to have sex with as many women as possible, while women need to find the best man they can because she has a more evolutionary investment. They also argue that evolution believes that men would naturally fear having to raise other men's children, and so that if they could see that the woman resisted the men because she was more physically traumatised, then it wouldn't be so bad as if she'd chosen to go with someone else. So they would fear. So women will feel less mental anguish the more physically brutalised they are. As I say, I've no idea where that idea comes from. So to test this hypothesis, Thornhill and Palmer studied scorpion flies, common lab instrument, and in the scorpion fly, the courting male offers a nuptial gift, usually a dead insect, and then while she is consuming the insect, he mates with her, or alternatively they chase a female and take her by force. The first strategy is preferred, but when males lack the resources to bestow nuptial gifts, then rape is seen as an alternative strategy. So they argue that the males without gifts tend to be the wimpier ones that failed in the male-to-male competition. And so they deduce from this that, like scorpion flies, human rape is the result of eons of past Darwinian selection, and there is no doubt that rape has evolutionary and hence genetic origins. So they argue that rape is in its essence a sexual act. It's not about power as feminists have claimed, but it's a natural, if deplorable, biological phenomena that enabled ancestral males to succeed reproductively even when they lacked the genes or material or social resources that might have made them attractive to women. Rape exists today because it's an evolved alternative reproductive strategy, and over evolutionary time, some men have succeeded in passing on their genes through rape and thus perpetuating the behaviour. They argue that reproductive age rape victims experience more trauma than child rape victims or postmenopausal rape victims because her mating choice has been circumvented by the rape. So reproductive age rape victims should be most likely to fight back and even to escalate their resistance because of the greater evolutionary historical cost to their reproductive success. Of course, Thornhill and Palmer don't approve of rape, but they argue that only by acknowledging its evolutionary rapes can prevention tactics be devised that really work. For example, sense rape is all about sex. One way to reduce it is discourage women from being sexy, say by not wearing revealing clothes. Well, the critique. Thornhill and Palmer reject feminist explanations of rape as too emotional. They don't define wimpiness in flies, or indeed what rape might mean for scorpion flies, and it doesn't explain very much about scorpion flies either. It doesn't explain how the evolution of behaviour in scorpion flies is the same or different for humans. It's merely suggestive. They give no evidence for the issue of trauma, and there is no evidence that clothing, age, reproductive capacity is correlated to the likelihood of being raped, or wimpiness or lack of resources a characteristic of human rapists. So it isn't very good science. The feminist critique, of course, of rape is that males bond by sharing sexual experiences, and this involves gang rape of women. It exists particularly in and around the culture of sport, around aggression and conquest, and is part of the need to prove one's masculinity. And that rape does not always occur, or doesn't usually occur in the lone rail mapist in the dark alley attacking someone is a relatively rare case, and the major case for rapes are, people you know. So it ties to much more common everyday senses of masculinity, is the need to assert one's masculinity, or the need to claim one's rights as a man in relation to women. Of course, it reflects the very sexist ideas of rape that exist in our society, that she asked for it, and leads to blaming the victim. I think we're all familiar enough with those sort of myths, which takes us back to why sociologists get emotional about these sort of evolution of rape ideas. It doesn't spell out, Thornhill and Palmer don't spell out the connections, that if you want to say it's biological, then you need to make the connections. What is being discovered here is not new. It's simply a rationalisation of cultural stereotypes by creating some sort of scientific archetype. They don't provide evidence, but a suggestive metaphor which seems true because we share in the cultural narrative. It's like understanding history through the Flintstones. Let me give you some other examples of the way the culture interprets things. Right, a pride of lions, for example, is typically understood as a harem, as a dominant male who has a group of females who are his subordinates, and he's the king of beasts. It could equally be read as the story of a group of females who simply keep him around as a stud animal. The female lions do all the hunting, they do the raising of the young, and he's really just there to reproduce the tribe. Now, both of those, of course, are human stories about what's happening in a pride of lions. The one that's culturally dominant is the one that reinforces the notion of male superiority. The Human Genome Project should be an example of how genetics is not the cause of human behaviour. If a fruit fly has 13,000 genes and a roundworm 19,000, then you would imagine that human beings would have 50 to 100,000 genes to explain all of their complex behaviours, but humans only have about 30,000 genes, and that's about the same amount as corn. And again, as I need to be clear about that, we are not clear about, even though the body has the same DNA in every cell, clearly each cell is not identical. And we are not very clear about exactly how the body knows how to reproduce the eyes, the ears, the fingers. What is the signalling process that allows the body to develop in the way it does, and how does the DNA gene complex that creates the cell know that this is going to be a nose cell and this is going to be an ear cell? We have some work on that, of course, but the process is far from clear. And yet often it's common in the media to see people move from genes cause alcoholism, so the genes go through the biology to a social outcome in ways that are far and away above what we understand. There are some exceptions, Huntington's disease and stuff, we can say, well, that gene gives rise to this and this and this process, and that causes the disease, but those things are comparatively rare. I think we need to understand the notion of social construction, particularly in relation to sexuality. We don't do a lot with heterosexuality at this point, but I think again we have that overwhelming idea that sexuality is a private matter, attraction between two individuals, when in fact sociologists say it's a highly complex set of symbols that structural behaviour between men and women all the time, not just in sexual relationships. I put this picture up because it's a picture of an old friend of mine, and this picture happened to be out when my girls were here last, and they kind of immediately responded by going, "Oh yuck, she's got hairy armpits," which I frankly hadn't even noticed, but it did make me think about culture and desire, and why do we live in a culture where women shave their legs and armpits and more their pubic hair? What are the implications of this practice? It's not universal. It's fairly recent that women started shaving as much as they do. Now, women are under pressure to conform to it, and men are indoctrinated to be turned off sexually by hairy women. So what does this hairlessness symbolise in our culture? What are we to make of it? Now, it's complex, and I don't want to oversimplify it, but I'll leave you to think about what sorts of meaning is attached to hairlessness in our culture and what that might mean. So the culture is an important part of the way we need to understand gender and sexuality. We have all these kind of stories that reinforce the stereotypes. We grow up, once upon a time there was a handsome prince, and the beautiful maid wins him over in some form. Usually he's not the handsome prince, normally he's the frog when he's first met, but through her moral superiority she's able to kiss him and turn him into a handsome prince. And that's the sort of basic romance narrative. Women, by assertion of their goodness and their beauty, are able to civilise men who otherwise would be frogs, but they can assert this power over men and convert them into civilised beings, which of course, all of which is a very odd cultural narrative. The other ones, you'll be familiar with, the Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus kind of series, which postulates that men and women come from different planets. I mean, of course, there's a jest in there as well, but that active and passive kind of notion that Mars the planet of war, Venus the planet of love. So they're these two, very standard, very old stories that are recycled into popular culture as some sort of new discovery. The scientific ones already mentioned the sort of notion of the lion as a king of beast or a stud male, depends on how you read it, both of which of course are cultural narratives. Neither are more or less true of lion behaviour than than it is of scorpion flies or anything else. Gorillas, we typically historically have seen gorillas as the sort of aggressive dominant male, when in fact it's gorillas are not especially aggressive creatures and they're vegetarian. Older male gorillas look after the children, do all sorts of things that older dominant males in our culture don't do. There's one that's a famous article called Egg and Sperm, a Scientific Romance, that looked at a whole range of discourses about reproduction in science textbooks and teased out the way gender is reproduced in the way these stories are told. So you've got a picture there of the egg and the sperm, and when you describe the process of reproduction you find that the egg is passive, it drifts down the fallopian tube. Sex, of course, is penetration, when we could equally think of it as enclosure, but because we automatically see it from the male's point of view, it's seen as penetration, and the active male penetrating the female, not the active woman enclosing the male. Ovaries are wasteful because they contain more eggs than are needed for reproduction. Women are born with more eggs than they'll actually use, so that's described as wasteful. Contrary-wise, sperm are active, they swim, they struggle, they're valiant, they're in a competition with each other to get to the egg. Testicles are energetic when they produce 100 million sperm a day, far in excess of what is required to reproduce the species, but it's not regarded as wasteful, but as an example of how energetic they are. So there's just a few examples to throw around about the role in which culture is seen to creep into the scientific explanations at a descriptive level. And so I think it's important to see the way in which science and culture and sexism and racism have helped to reproduce each other. And now we'll go into part C. Right, so in the last part we've looked at sex and race as forms of biological determinism and as ways that science is used to explain and justify sexism by arguing that it's caused by biology. Now, science has an enormous authority in our culture, and in many respects with good reason. It's an enormously powerful tool, as I said, but it's also interesting to note more recently that its authority has been challenged, because although science has a lot of authority, there are other power structures in our society, like class and race and gender, In the case of anthropogenic global warming, scientists are saying that the way our society is organised is producing too much carbon, and that is warming up the globe and is a danger to future life on the planet. And just bracketing aside the debate about global warming, it's interesting here that you have a case of 99% of the world's scientists saying that this is a serious threat, but because it is a threat, that to address that issue will require social changes that will affect the powerful, particularly those who own the factories and are producing the carbon, that require some change on behalf of the government or the capitalists who own the factories that are producing the carbon. That this means that the authority of science is challenging a much deeper and entrenched power structure, and in that sense there becomes a debate about what the science means in ways that it very rarely is challenged. So that's an interesting recent effect. So I think that this is also, these debates show the importance of history. It helps to think back to scientific explanations at the turn of the century and the things they were being used for, that women couldn't vote, that they couldn't get a degree, that black people were inferior, that women were hysterical, whatever set of constellations they were using, that we can look at the Human Genome Project and have reason to be suspicious that reductionism has had negative consequences, that there is something limited about looking at in a purely reductionist sense. There are more holistic ways of looking at things, and certainly the many aspects of modern science are moving in this direction, but looking at Fritjof Capra's work, that nature works by creating communities and relationships, I suggest you go and have another listen, and have a listen to the whole interview. It's quite interesting. But all systems are nested within each other. There are indeed genes, and those genes are encoded in DNA, and those DNA exist in nuclei. Those nuclei exist in cells. The cells make up organs. The organs make up organisms, and organisms make up communities. And then there are various communities, living in the same space. So what we try to emphasise is that each of those layers is certainly a worthwhile study. Physics and chemistry and biology and sociology are all important areas of study, and they're all needed for a full understanding, and the links between them are important, but it's important not to be a reductionist. It's important not to say, well, this is really all about genes, or it's really all about DNA, or it's really all about what's happening at the cellular level. It's those levels are all emergent from one another. So in the last little part of this lecture, I'd like to reprise the issue of feminism. We did talk about it briefly last time, but we can't talk about sex and gender without mentioning feminist theories, and so I wanted to have a bit of a look at the history of feminist ideas. I mean, most people have a very stereotyped view of feminism, and we'll talk about why that might be. But the first wave of feminism goes back to the 1850s, and there were two main strands, and have been since that time, a liberal version of feminism. So liberalism focused on education for women and votes for women. You can see the key historical names there. 1848 Women's Rights Convention at Seneca Falls. In the US, John Stuart Mill wrote a famous book on the subjection of women in 1869, and that's sort of people like Harriet Tubman, anti-slavery campaigners, Susan B. Anthony. You might have heard her mentioned on The Simpsons, with Lisa being a supporter of Susan B. Anthony, and Charlotte Perkins Gilman. On the other side were the Marxists, who mainly focused on jobs and were interested in the links between class and capitalism. Engels wrote a famous book in the 1880s on the family, private property and the state, and names like Clara Zetkin in Germany, who started the first International Women's Day around about the turn of the century, about 1908 I think it was. Alexandra Kollontai was the first woman cabinet minister in history, and she was cabinet minister in the Bolshevik government when they led the revolution in Russia in 1917, which was actually triggered by an International Women's Day march, so women played quite a big role there. When most of us think of feminism, we think of the recent second wave of feminism that came in the 1960s to the 1980s. Again, you had these similar divisions with liberals and Marxists, but the new one was radical feminists. So liberals again focused on equity in schools, they're getting rid of the sexist images in school books, equal pay. We just celebrated Betty Friedan's, the anniversary of Betty Friedan's famous book, The Feminine Mystique. And people who know the Australian Germaine Greer, of course, is often pilloried in the press, but is probably one of the leading intellectuals in Australia. What was distinct about the second wave was the rise of a radical feminist group who particularly brought to the fore issues of rape and domestic violence and pornography, which previously hadn't been serious political issues. They were seen as private matters, but it was largely the radical feminists like Andrew Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon and their supporters who raised these issues and began seeing things like domestic violence as political issues. Now everybody would accept there's a political dimension to those things, but they were the first ones to raise those issues. So as we said, each of them tackles different problems, it offers different explanations for patriarchy and suggests different strategies. Each has made an important contribution to our understanding of gender. It's probably the most vigorous intellectual movement in the last 30 or 40 years. There's also been a large backlash, which was written about in the early 90s by Susan Faludi in her book of that name, and said that while there had been progress, the Matrix, getting back to our image of the Matrix, is not without protecting the systems of male dominance. So biological explanations are still very strong. There's pressure on women to return to traditional roles. You see the Abbott government, the Howard government rather, paying women a baby bonus and so on. Conservative views in gender are still very commonly promoted, like the John Gray stuff about men are from Mars and women are from Venus. It still strikes a chord with people. There's a discourse about women having one equal rights, which, as we know from the evidence, isn't true. But they also argue that to the extent that women have done them, then they're also victims. They're not happy at work and have all the problems that men have now, in addition to working at home. So the career thing hasn't worked out, and it's women prefer to be in traditional roles. There's also a large men's rights movement which displaces men's legitimate, I think, concerns, issues about the way masculinity is constructed in our society. I don't see it that way, of course, but the way the issues that men have around health, around violence, and so on, are displaced into an attack on feminism rather than into an attack on the people who are actually in the business of promoting inequality. So I guess I just really want to wind this up by saying that the textbook talks about nature or nurture, and we need to get away from that kind of dualism. I mean, very few people are strict biological determinists. No, an organism doesn't survive outside of an environment. So of course there's going to be an interaction. If you didn't feed any organism, it's going to die. So obviously there's got to be some connection with the environment. So a strict biological determinism is wrong. It simply doesn't do justice to, no one takes that extremism, it doesn't do justice to the cultural variety and the global nature and the historical sense of what it means to be society, as is a strict social determinism, the idea that somehow biology plays no role whatsoever. To get around that sort of binary between social and biological determinism, we don't want to end up mixing the two together, which is typically what people do, say it's a bit of both. As Raymond Connell says in a famous article, that if biological determinism is wrong and social determinism is wrong, then a mixture of them is unlikely to be correct. And so sociologists don't deny that the body has a role in social life, and it's not a purely passive receiver of things, but there is a whole lot of thinking in the last 20 or 30 years to think of better ways about how we can understand the body, starting with issues like anorexia, which clearly is a biological phenomenon and has a biological component. You can't not eat and have no effects on the body, but clearly it's tied to the meanings and the cultural meanings that are given to the body around thinness and the beauty myth and so on. So it's the meanings of the body that matter, but how you experience things is a bodily thing, not an individual thing, and it's shaped by the culture. And we have an advanced course, Body Sexuality in Society, that deals with those sorts of things. So that's it for week 5. Just a quick summary of what we did there, really. Just looking at reductionism and the issue of reductionism and the way that science, for all its power and importance, we also need to develop a critical attitude, and we can look at the history to see the way in which what we're taking as common sense or scientific explanations, or that certain behaviours were natural, has now been debunked, and we've moved on, admittedly, through the use of science often, but we've got to be careful to be critical of science as a way of reproducing inequalities. So we're always very suspicious about anything being natural, and so we're very careful to interrogate those in sociology. Thanks a lot.